Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Good morning and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Khurma and I head the Middle East Special Initiatives here at Wilson. We're very delighted to be hosting Ariel Ahram this morning, who is a Wilson Fellow, to launch his new book, Break All the Borders, Separatism and Reshaping of the Middle East. It is not only a very important read, but a very timely read as we continue to see different tectonic shifts in the region involving both state and non-state actors. So thank you, Ariel, for being here this morning. I will let Ariel talk about, of course, his own book, but suffice it to say that his account is a very rich one, basically explaining different separatist movements from in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and of course the Islamic State in particular. And it is one that is not only goes back to the 2011 or 2010 Arab uprisings, but has a very deep and rich historical context. And also gives us some food for thought for the future of the region and the future stability of the region based on his analysis of these separatist movements. I'd like to also introduce David Ottaway, who's a Middle East Fellow here at the Wilson Center and a veteran Washington Post journalist who will be commenting on the book and also moderating the discussion with Ariel. So without further ado, welcome back, Ariel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. There's a special kind of pleasure to come back to a place where I worked and where I found myself such a productive and really rich experience. I started my fellowship here the week before Inauguration Day in January 2017. I stayed until the first week in August of 2017, so it's been a bit of time, but I still really remember what great colleagues and great support I had at the Wilson Center. Even before that, I should mention, I was a research assistant here as a graduate student in 2003, I think, 2004. I don't remember exactly, but I feel like I have this long connection to the center, and each time I come here, I come back learning something new, thinking about something that I hadn't really considered. So I hope I can do the same in this talk. The title of the book, Break All the Borders, comes from a pretty famous web video that was published by the Islamic State in June 2014. This guy, who is known as the Chilean, talked about how this is not the first border we will break. Inshallah, we will break all the borders, and ISIS has a real knack from having catchy phrases, so I like that phrase. It makes for a good title. When I started working on this book, I thought that I was really going to talk about ISIS. I thought ISIS was the most interesting example of border breaking. But the more that I looked at the Islamic State, the more that I realized that even though they were different from and new in so many ways, they were also an old idea. The idea of changing borders in the region was not something that the Islamic State invented. In fact, there were a number of actors who came to the fore in 2011, 2012, who talked about adjusting borders in different ways. And what was especially interesting to me is the ideas, the differences and similarities that these actors had. So this statement came from the capture of the Tanf border between Syria and Iraq, June 2014, the ISIS explosion. It came, I think, a week before they managed to take Mosul, Iraq's second or third, probably third largest city. And in the discussion, the Chilean specifically talked about how this is not just going to break all the borders, but it's going to break the borders that were foisted on the region by Sykes and Picot. Everyone who's a Middle East specialist has seen this map in some format. The idea of changing borders, breaking borders, is this kind of a Middle East obsession. And it's this obsession that's shared within the region and also by actors and analysts outside of the region. So Sykes and Picot had this vision for the region in January of 1916. This is going to be to split the region up between Britain and France. Now, there's a sort of vague similarity here, but most of what Sykes and Picot envisioned never actually happened. In 2008, in a very influential article in the Armed Forces Journal, Ralph Peters talked about how the possibilities of state breakdown would foster new states in the region. And then even more recently, 2013, Robin Wright, my colleague here when I was at Wilson, she also offered an idea of a sort of a new map. Drawing new maps of the Middle East is a particular kind of pastime. Now, what's interesting and what's especially remarkable is that while Westerners tend to think of the region, the states of the region, as being too big, pulling together too many groups, most actors within the region, for the most part, have imagined the states as being too small. Right? The Islamic State's argument was not that the states it's not that they didn't want to be part of a state, but that they said the state that we have is too small, the borders we have subdivide us too much. And they talked about having these sort of vice principalities, vice regencies that would span from the Atlas all the way into Khorasan. Only particular actors within the region, though, have talked about making smaller borders. And the task that I set out for myself in the book is to talk about how we went from a period of political revolution in the region, beginning in Tunisia and then in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria. How come these revolutions, which began with almost no separatist involvement, right? They were revolutions that began in the center, and that the push was to try and get control over the power center, over the capital. How separatism was spawned from this moment. So at the beginning of the uprisings in 2011, the main axis of conflict was between opposition and national governments, right? There was a lot of defection from within the regime. The national opposition groups had a strategy to try and co-opt nationalism, co-opt the idea of patriotism, saying, we're the real Egyptians, we're the real Syrians, we're the real Yemenis. This regime that we have that's cloaked itself in the flag does not represent the will of the people. And by beginning to make this claim that the opposition represents nationalism and self-determination, they also opened up the idea of the potential for foreign intervention, because if the people are being suppressed, if self-determination is not being fulfilled here, then it's the obligation of the international community to try and solve this problem. What began with essentially domestic disputes, essentially internal political disputes between opposition and regime leaders, and sometimes sort of street activists, very quickly became an international dispute to try and enlist support from the international community for one side or the other. Both the opposition and the regimes tried to call on old favors to keep themselves in power. They talked about responsibility to protect. They talked about the need to combat terrorism. They talked about stability. And at different times, different international actors bought or didn't buy these arguments, right? But what the Syrian opposition was saying was almost exactly the same as the Egyptian opposition was saying, but they got different kinds of responses from the United States and the European Union. But within this, or sort of spinning out of this conflict in the center, were secessionists, groups that really wanted to be separated from the central government, not a part of it. And they exploited the weakness of the central government to take over control over areas in the periphery, areas where the central government's reach was minimal. And they often reasserted prior ideas of identity. They said, well, this state that we're a part of is a failed state. It's a failed experiment. We have something better that comes from the past. We could have done this 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, and we didn't do it. But now is our moment. And they also began to appeal to the international community for moral and political support. Overall, I think this goes to the kind of the bigger changes that we saw in the region, these sort of fundamental changes in the norms and practices that made states showing up in 2011. Now, as a political scientist, I'd like to have definitions, so I'll give my definition of separatism. What's the subject? What's the real subject of the study? And I use an old definition from Donald Horowitz. Separatists are actors that seek some form of self-governance over territory. This encompasses both secession, so outright claims to independence, but also unilateral autonomy, right? Where you say, I don't care what the central government, if they acknowledge it, we are going to set up our own federal district, regardless of the will of the central government. We're going to create a fact on the ground. Separatism has been is not just a Middle East phenomenon. In fact, one of the things I talk about in the early parts of the book is that separatist movements have been rising across the region through the 1990s into the 2000s. And it's resulted in all kinds of weird arrays of sovereignty, all kinds of strange de facto states. Think Transnistria or Northern Cyprus. Places that lack sovereignty, don't have international recognition, but that are functionally completely off the grid from the central government. Don't respond to the central government, don't think the central government has any responsibilities for them, and try and operate completely independently of it. Another, Somaliland is another example. And so this trend is an extension of the trend that began outside of the region that reaches the Middle East in 2011. One of the big causes of this global nation-state crisis is a kind of vacillation on the part of the United States about whether they want to keep states intact, whether it's really necessary to have a state called Iraq or Syria or Yemen or Libya. So in February 2016, John Kerry at a meeting at the UN says, it may be too late to keep Syria intact. Right? We may have to be thinking about Plan B. Maybe we should think about breaking Syria up. 2 days later, the United States, along with members of the UN Security Council, vote for this resolution that specifically rules out the possibility of breaking up Syria. There seems to be a kind of an intellectual logjam here. Someone not able to make up their mind about what to do with a problem like Syria. And this is not just Syria, of course, this goes on across the region. There you have these discussions about possibly breaking states up, but then falling back on territorial integrity as the guidepost. There were two big secessionist movements that were already active in 2011, that were already on the map, although in much smaller forms. The first in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the second in South Yemen. Right? There had been a long-standing constitutional crisis in northern Iraq over exactly where the KRG authority began and ended, and whether the KRG should have more autonomy than the Constitution allowed. I'm not a constitutional scholar. I won't get into the who is at fault in this discussion, but there was a crisis already. There was also a secessionist movement in southern Yemen, what was at that time called Al-Iraq. It became the Muqawama, the resistance. But these were sort of things that no one really thought about as being especially important. These were peripheral issues within the region. By 2013, 2014, you had the rise of separatist movements in Cyrenaica, eastern Libya, which hardly anyone imagined, partly because no one really knew much about Libya before the uprising to begin with. And then the kind of the black sheep of the separatist fold, the Islamic State, Daesh, which appeared, it also had its roots in the previous decade, but that no one really thought about as a possibility until it sort of appeared suddenly on the doorstep of Iraq and Syria. I think there are three big ways to think about separatists, where separatists come from. The first is to think about separatism as a reflection of domestic politics, right? You have domestic cleavages. Some groups decide they want to opt out of the state. You get separatism. And if these groups have access to oil or other kinds of resources, it makes it easier to secede. The second way is a kind of an outside-in theory, that regardless of what's going on inside the state, the international community sets the terms that allow separatists to succeed or fail. They give incentives. They provide material support. They provide economic support. Sometimes they say, we'll allow you a seat at the UN. Right? This is the South Sudan example. Right? So, and that it's really the international community that allows or prevents separatism from emerging. A third theory is a kind of more historical theory, something that's grounded more in kind of what comes before the separatist movement. And this is a theory that stems out of the experience of the breakup of the Soviet Union, which is that separatists tend to arise in places that were already segmented, where there was pre-existing federal boundaries, think Soviet Union, or where there was a previous history of a kind of a revolt, a state-building process that failed, but left seeds for a future rebellion, a kind of a lost state in its midst. Think about the Confederacy of the United States and how long, 100 years after the war, there are still people who trying to argue that the Confederacy still has roots in American politics, right? So these historical arguments, I think, to my mind, and one of the drives of the book is that these historical arguments, I think, are some of the most important. That the places that you see separatism show up in the Middle East are not places where you have deep ethnic cleavages, not places where the international community chooses winners, but where there are previous histories of failed states, previous lost states, or federal boundaries that reflect the existence of these lost states. Why does conquered states, lost states, why does it lead to separatism? Well, I think that there are two reasons. The first is that the memory of these lost states provides a kind of a domestic pole of attraction for people to think about it. It gives something people to focus on. Oftentimes, these states had their own parliaments, their own political parties, their own currencies. And those things don't go away. They're still part of the public discourse, even if it's sort of kept in secret. The second is that rebels use the existence of a prior state to appeal to the international community. They say, there was a state here before that got lost. If you reinstate it, we can solve some of the problems that you're facing for global security. We can be your allies in pursuing stability, countering terrorism, things like that. Of course, the big exception for that is ISIS, right? ISIS didn't want to have support from the international community. It explicitly tried to overrule the international community. But all the other ones, Kurdistan, Cyrenaica, South Yemen, they've been begging for support from the outside, saying, we can solve your terrorism problems. We can solve your stability problems. We often don't think about the history of the Middle East. We often think about the history of the Middle East as the history of the winners, right? That's almost all history is history of winners. But there's a long history of lost states in the Middle East. We could begin with the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad in Syria, in Iran in 1946. But there's a lot of these sort of states that, for various reasons, fail, get absorbed, never get born, aborted. And when we go back to that map, we start to see the roots of this modern separatist movement or contemporary separatist movements. Again, another political scientist conceit, we like to have tables. But if we look at the countries that had major uprisings, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, every place where there had been a history of a dead state, you saw a separatist movement arise. In places where there was no dead state, even countries that have deep ethnic divisions like Bahrain, no separatists. Does everyone follow this logic so far? I have a sort of a more formal demonstration of this, which I won't bore you with, but I think it's interesting to think about how this overlay of the old map and the new map shows up. This kind of palimpsest of old political structures that reappear when states seem to be faltering. So here's a case study. This is my personal favorite case study because I think it was the one that I knew the least about when I started working on the book, and that I had, I feel like I had the most fun learning about, which is the separatist movement in Cyrenaica. Libya had historically been divided between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, between east and west. Cyrenaica had a distinctive political identity based on the Sanufi tribal tradition, and the Sanufi Sunni tradition and tribalism. And the Senussis were involved in a number of anti-colonial rebellions, starting against the Italians and going into the 1950s. When the UN negotiated for the recognition of Libya and its admission they required that Cyrenaica merge with Tripolitania. They said that Cyrenaica itself was too small, underpopulated, underdeveloped to be a viable state. So this picture, I'll go fast here. This is King Idris of Libya, King Idris of Senussi, celebrating Libya's independence at the Manar Palace in Benghazi the day before Christmas 1951. What's especially interesting about this picture, though, is that a year earlier, he had stood on the same balcony and declared the independence of Cyrenaica as an independent Islamic emirate with the support from the British. Independent Cyrenaica merged into Libya. And for the first 10 years of Libya's existence, Cyrenaica had its own parliament, its own mineral rights, so it negotiated its own oil contracts, its own army, and it was considered to be the stronghold of the Libyan monarchy. For a number of reasons, that federalist arrangement, where the three elements of Libya was changed, and then with Gaddafi's revolution, there was a dramatic centralization. But the point is that Cyrenaica existed as a political entity before Libya did, not just as an idea, as a region, but as a state. When the revolution came in February 2011, the revolution began in Benghazi, the capital of Cyrenaica. And even though the first revolutionary moments had almost no separatists, right? There was no mention that Cyrenaica should be separated. There was no, the first revolutionary flag reverted to the Senussi flag, which put, I don't know if you can see that. We'll go back one. You see that flag, the crescent flag, the black crescent flag? See the black crescent flag, and then the new Libyan flag? That's the Cyrenaican flag, the black with a white crescent. The separatists, the revolutionary movement, implicitly started talking about the reinstatement of Cyrenaica as a political entity. Whether that was a federal entity or an independent state wasn't clear. But as the Libyan government, the transitional government failed, became completely unable to manage security, separatists stood up. The tribes in eastern Libya that had long-standing connections to the Senussi monarchy began to demand a reinstatement of the political autonomy that they had enjoyed, that their forefathers had enjoyed up until 1963. In 2014, one of the leading separatist movements, this man Ibrahim Jathran, who is a sort of part criminal, part separatist, launched a raid and took over the oil installations in eastern Libya, and he demanded that the central government pay his salary and that they keep the revenue from the oil sales not to go to Tripoli, but to keep it in Cyrenaica, which had been the terms of the old constitution. Jathran was a kind of an adventurer and pretty shady character, but there was a kind of a more friendly face to the separatist movement as well. Someone like this man, Osama Bouera, his father, Abu Bakr Bouera, is the senior most politician in the Eastern Parliament, in the parliament in Benghazi. Abu Bakr Bouera trained in the U.S. He has a degree in I think in business. He taught business at the University of Misrata. Speaks English. Osama Bouera became the spokesman for the more radical separatist movements, his son. And he has this line where he says, the inhabitants of Cyrenaica have a unique and common identity. Cyrenaica has always been an independent emirate. We want political recognition nationally and internationally. This has already begun with support from Russia and a certain US politician. We know who that politician was now, right? Bouera and his allies were in contact with Sebastian Gorka and with various people from the Trump administration. They believed that at the election, with the Trump election, they were going to get international recognition, that the moment was going to come for them. It turned out the politics was a little bit more complicated than that. And I could talk about how the separatists have been sort of overridden by General Haftar in eastern Libya. That now Haftar, who is not a separatist but sort of is based in eastern Libya, is now sort of dominating the separatist cause. But the idea of independent independent Cyrenaica, is still around, and the militias that protected Cyrenaica from ISIS, from Tripoli, from Al-Qaeda, if you ask them, from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of their main adversaries, they're still a pretty potent force in eastern Libya. When I started working on this project, it was, I think, late 2015. I really thought that by the time I was done, I was going to have one separatist success story. The most likely one I thought was Iraqi Kurdistan. I thought that some deal would be worked out, and Iraqi Kurdistan would get the South Sudan benefit and go on its own, become the next Kosovo or South Sudan. Not the civil war part, but the independence part. I was wrong. And almost across the board, the separatists have sort of taken their shot and lost. But separatism is a persistent and durable phenomenon, durable idea. And so even in kind of military loss, the separatists have become what we could call the next generation of spoilers. As countries like Syria and Iraq, and to a lesser extent Libya and Yemen, begin their transition into political reconciliation, sort of the wars are ending or winding down, we're talking about ways to bring people back into the fold. The separatists are the groups that refuse to come back. They're the ones that want to have the least to do with the central government. Right? Most of our formulas for political reconciliation center on the idea of building up the state, right? Create a central government that can pull people into it. Well, that might be okay for certain kinds of opposition forces, but the separatists, their whole raison d'etre is to prevent and avoid being pulled into the center. So one by one, I think the separatists are positioning themselves to become the next spoilers, to block political reconciliation projects. In Iraq, the separatists pushed the referendum. The referendum was overwhelmingly successful, but politically a complete failure, and the Kurdish military was pushed out of Kirkuk and most of the territories that it had conquered in 2014. There seems to be some idea that Erbil and Baghdad are trying to make nice with each other, but I don't think anyone would bet that separatism is a done deal for Iraq. I don't think anyone should be surprised if 5 or 10 years from now, separatism comes back on the table in some form, especially with the election of the new Kurdish leadership in the KRG. In Syria, the Kurdish separatists, the PYD, have remained the main focal point of the U.S. Military operations there. They're by far the most important element in the Syrian Democratic Forces. With the U.S. plans for withdrawal, this puts the PYD in a really precarious position, but there's still no real political solution for them. The only way for them to succeed is to fight. And fight they probably will, right? As Syria moves into political reconciliation, the question of what to do with the Northeast is still the most likely place where you'll see a renewal of violence. In Libya, most of the separatist militias have been kind of exhausted during the course of the civil war. General Haftar made it a point to put them at the front line and have them fight themselves essentially into the ground. But as the maneuver on Tripoli, as Haftar's attempt to conquer Tripoli has faltered and now ground to a slow halt, and now you have a siege of Tripoli, the further Haftar moves from his base in the east, the more opportunities the separatists have to reemerge, because Haftar, the cat's away, the mice are playing. As long as Haftar's forces are trying to take Tripoli, the more likely the separatists are to make a move in Benghazi. And finally, the situation in Yemen, where I think the separatists have been far more consequential than anyone has given them credit for. They built this very strong alliance with the UAE. They've refused the Stockholm Agreement, the December 2018 agreement, this kind of framework for negotiation. They stand completely outside of it. They were not consulted. They were not parties to the agreement. And they've been pretty clear that they're not going to abide by it. As the UAE is kind of repositioning itself in the Gulf and pulling out, the separatist movement, the southern resistance, is extremely powerful, dominates Aden. It's a sort of funny situation where you have the Hadi government claims to be representing Yemen. Not only does it not control the capital in Sana'a, it doesn't control the alternative capital in Aden. The alternative capital is under the control of the separatists. And there still is no political plan for what to do with the separatist cause. Even if the Houthis and the Hadi government come to an agreement tomorrow about how to reinstate Yemen, the separatists will still want to be a part. So this goes to my overall argument, that's sort of my update of the argument that I get to do since I finished the book, which is that the separatists obviously didn't succeed, but they're still in a position to ruin a lot of things if we don't address the issues of borders that they raised. So here are my big political science general conclusions. But the separatists seize the opportunity of state breakdown. They're rarely strong enough alone. They have to wait for windows of opportunity. And these opportunities come oftentimes because of the availability of oil or other natural resources. They make deals with international patrons. The separatists are also probably the last actors in the region to seriously consider self-determination as an important idea. Right? This is an interesting thing to say at the Wilson Center, but the separatists are the last Wilsonians, certainly in the Middle East. The Middle East was shaped by this idea of self-determination. The mandates, the decolonization process was all shaped by Wilson's 14 points, over and over again, from Yasser Arafat's speech at the UN in 1974 to the Hashemite rebellions. They all were talking about Woodrow Wilson. The separatists are the last people who are talking about Wilson. They don't make claims for tribalism or some kind of ancient lost civilization, except for ISIS, which is an odd case I can talk about in the. They make claims based on the idea that they should have had a seat at the League of Nations. They made claims that they should have had a seat at the UN, and they were denied it, and that was a mistake. And this mistake can be rectified now, right? They're imagining a new Wilsonian moment. And finally, right, we wouldn't be Washington without some kind of prognostication of future prediction. Where will the next separatist conflicts be? Right? Well, I think that there are a couple of places that to understand, to predict where separatists will be, I think we have to look at where political boundaries used to be, where there were histories of failed states. So I think if we look at Western Sahara and the Rif in Morocco, we already have movements of national self-determination. The Rif one is actually getting stronger. We can also look at cases like Al-Hassa Asir in Saudi Arabia, also the Hijaz in different ways, right? And Palestine, which is an interesting kind of another very, very idiosyncratic case, but where the movements of national liberation are staking a claim on prior statehood, that there's a recognition of our state and we didn't get it. We don't have it yet, and we're waiting for it. All of this will depend on, again, on a breakdown, right? The separatists alone are not strong enough to make much political hay. But if there is a breakdown of political authority, if there happens to be a second Arab Spring in Riyadh or in Rabat that actually actually causes the regime to break down and see defections, I think we could imagine cases where separatists reassert themselves, and we have again these kinds of quasi or de facto states operating in big swaths of territory, but lacking international recognition. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. That's really, you really covered the waterfront. And there are so many different groups now operating in the Middle East that it's incredible. And fortunately, you provide acronyms at the beginning of your book. And there are 64 acronyms to cover all the liberation movements, all the organizations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in those 4 countries, I wanted to start, I was really looking forward. At least I hope we'll think about it going forward. There are 2 models now of de jure but non-functioning segmented states, Somalia and Lebanon. We've been living with Somalia since 1991, divided into 3 parts. With Somaliland gaining more and more regional recognition, if not international recognition, making deals with the UAE to develop their port, Berbera, et cetera, et cetera. So they're beginning to get some kind of regional recognition, if not international recognition. Lebanon, we all know, is a state in name only, and it's segmented by religious groups. And the region and the whole community, the international community, have lived with these 2 types of segmented, non-functioning de jure states.
Yeah.
When you think about Syria and Iraq in particular, are we going to see more Lebanons, more Somalis? And which is more likely? And
I think overall the international community has become more tolerant for these kinds of de jure states that have sovereignty but very limited functionality. There was a long time where there was an assumption that these are black holes in the international community, that terrorism is going to be rampant there. There'll be smuggling and black markets, and these places will be like the worst places in the world. In fact, they're certainly not the best, but they're not the worst. Lebanon works okay. Somalia works probably worse, but there are parts of Somalia that are doing okay as well, Somaliland in particular. And so I think the tolerance for that kind of discrepancy between juridical sovereignty and physical sovereignty, material sovereignty, is getting higher. I think, though, that the international community is more tolerant of it, but still doesn't know what to do with it. Right? It's something that they're aware of but don't know how to respond to. And the separatists are in a position to make the argument that the international community needs to engage these areas more intensively. And they can do that in a number of different ways. It doesn't require necessarily having a vote at the UN to formally grant them a seat. It can be done by allowing them access to the international banking system, right, which is a big issue for Somaliland. It's also become a very big issue in Yemen, where different areas are essentially cut off from global financial flows because they're on the wrong side of international sanctions. It can be done be done militarily with basing. It can be done diplomatically by having kind of Taiwan-style unofficial representatives. So I think there are a lot of tools in the toolbox to bring these areas into the international community without actually, without crossing the line of sovereignty. Personally, I think sovereignty is overrated. So it doesn't bother, I don't think that there is a slippery slope of recognition that if you recognize the Kurds then in Iraq, then it will just create more problems for everyone else. I don't think that that's true, but I know that that's the minority view overall. But I'm really sure, though, that the international community hasn't done enough to try and stabilize these areas and bring them to their full kind of political and developmental potential. There's a sense that, if there's no central government there, then we can't work there. I've had a number of conversations at the World Bank where I asked them, well, what do you do? How do you foster development in rebel-held territories in Syria? And their answer is, we don't, because everything we do has to go through Damascus, and they won't let us operate in rebel-held territories in Damascus. And so those areas are cut off the development grid, right? They don't get our assistance. I don't think that that's not the right way to handle areas outside of government control, separatists or others or otherwise, right?
Well, we have two examples of successful breakaways. One in Eritrea from Ethiopia, the South Sudan from North Sudan. These were negotiated, agreed upon separations in both cases. And unfortunately, South Sudan has turned into a disaster, but it was pretty bad even before. My question is, is it possible we're going to begin to see other negotiated separations between the center and the periphery in any of these movements you've looked at?
Negotiated? I don't think so. I think that the international community felt pretty burned, from South Sudan especially. Yeah. And Eritrea, South Sudan, also Kosovo, sort of fit this negotiated model. And I don't think anyone believes that these were good paths. So I don't think that the international community is going to be excited to try and make another negotiated agreement. But I do think that the international community might, as I said, might be willing to tolerate more kinds of devolutions of power, we could call it de facto federalism, than it had previously been willing to do.
Right. You were talking about South Yemen, which strikes me as a perfect example of probably the most, if there's any, most likely to spin away because of the reasons you were suggesting. And the fact South Yemen for 23 years was an independent entity, South Yemen. So it's got a history, it's got some experience in running itself, for better or for worse. So would you regard South Yemen as a good candidate for spinning away? And because you have the United Arab Emirates supporting it, you have the Saudis not opposing it. You have the Southern Transitional Council now with bureaus around the world, including here in Washington, and with the UAE sponsoring this separatist or reconstruction, whatever you want to call it, of South Yemen.
I think now, if I was putting odds on the horses, I think South Yemen is the most likely for secession. But there's a rub there, because as long as Yemen itself is such a disaster, they don't need to have secession, because they have everything. They have their own state without having to. They've actually declared independence a couple times, but they don't need to make the final step because they have everything else that they want. Yeah. This is where the big problem is that if there is a political deal where the Houthis and the Hadi government come to some kind of agreement and begin to put together Yemen again, then the issue of actual independence for Aden and Hadramat and Mahra, that becomes much more important, and that might force them to take a more formal declaration, seek international in a way that right now they don't really need to because they have things in hand anyway.
There's one example of an autonomous state. Puntland in Somalia calls itself an autonomous state, but it's not seeking independence.
Yeah.
Now, is it possible that we're going to begin to see Puntlands emerging in parts of the Arab world?
You know, Rojava in eastern Syria is very similar. It's a self-declared. We've unilaterally decided that we'll be autonomous but not independent. They did it. Right. The KRG from 1991 until 2005 was also a self-declared autonomous zone. So that idea is actually not too foreign to the Middle East, but it was always considered to be something so exceptional that it didn't really bear any scrutiny. Now I think it's becoming so common that we should pay attention to the possibilities of self-declared federalist enclaves within the state. Yeah, I think, and it wouldn't surprise me to see Cyrenaica also become a self-declared federalist entity that has close ties to Egypt and tries to keep Tripoli as far away, particularly when it comes to oil. Tries to keep Tripoli as far out of its business as it possibly can without inciting the ire of the international community that would force it.
So you have one country, two states.
Yeah.
Or three states or whatever.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've often wondered in Iraq is the sort of the federal system where you have. I understand what federal Kurdistan is, but I've always had a hard time identifying what do you call the entity that's not Kurdistan. There's it's this asymmetrical federal relationship. And making federal relationships that have just two entities is actually kind of tricky because getting the balance right is easy. It's hard to be Belgium. It's easy to be 3. It's easy to be 5. It's easy to be 50, because there's a symmetry there. When you're just talking about 2, it actually gets trickier. And so there might be a move to push for other federal states to balance those out.
Right. Your book really brings to the fore how the tribes in these countries have really revived. They've been the nucleus of support both for the state and for taking the state apart. So my question is, but this really applies particularly to Syria and Iraq, is the sense of nationalism, of being a Syrian, of being an Iraqi, still alive enough to hold these countries together, or are tribal identities or regional identities now sort of taking first place?
One of the hardest things that I've found to kind of put my mind around in the Middle East is how the two ideas of kind of tribal or sectarian identity and national identity often work together. There is this expression, what's good for General Motors is good for the U.S. I began my career working on Iraq. The number of people that I met who said, what's good for the Shia is good for Iraq, or what's good for the Sunni is good for Iraq. That this presumption that there's a kind of an overlap between their sectarian preferences and the preferences of the state, and that was not a problem for them. It was easy, in fact, to be an Iraqi patriot and a Shia sectarian or a Sunni sectarian. At the same time, I think that is becoming more common, and the states are deliberately promoting that idea that you can be a member of the Shamar tribe and a Syrian, right? That the Shamar tribe is Syria and Syria is the Shamar tribe, and so those things actually work together in ways that for a lot of Americans is sort of hard. It's hard to imagine. It's hard to put together. The number of, especially with sort of American. The assumption that these things have to be moving apart, I think they can move apart, but I think they're often go together. For the separatists, though, the the Separatists are especially notable because they push this idea that there is a separation.
Yeah.
That what they want to separate is their regional identity and the national identity. Whereas a lot of groups say our national identity, our regional identity, our sectarian identity go hand in hand. There's no conflict. It's easy to be both. Mm-hmm. And the Separatists are sort of forcing the question.
Okay, well, let's open it to the public. General questions. Tom, you want to start?
Thank you, yes. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
It begs one big question. The girl
Just
at the
one?
middle of the table, you only gave a quick mention of Arafat. So is that the next book? Are you leaving that for Aaron David to write, or the Trump plan to take hold before you deal with Israel, Palestine, and Jordan?
It's not going to be my next book. I can say that. So the Palestine is a very complicated case. To fit into the separatist, specifically to fit into the separatist mold. But I think that it bears a lot of the common characteristics. It has this Wilsonian effort to claim self-determination. It has a self-determination movement that gets attention from the international community and then gets ignored. It has its territory being divvied up, not just with Israel. There between Jordan and Egypt as well. And this appeal to the international community to kind of correct what they say is the historical mistake, whether it happened in 1948 or 1967 or 1919, depending on where you start your historical timeline. But there was an injustice done where the Wilsonian principle wasn't applied properly and should be applied again. The big difference, though, between the Palestinian case and these cases is that these cases almost all involve a seizure of kind of political power, physical control on the ground first, and appeal to the international community second. These groups, I think, would rather, if they had a choice between giving up their militia and getting a seat at the UN, they would say, well, keep the militias, forget the UN. The Palestinians have worked on both tracks. They've accrued kind of governance capacity, and a security force and economic forces in some respects, but their main progress has been in the international arena. They've gone much further at the UN than what would be reflected if you walked around in Ramallah. So they're stuck. They're stuck in a number of different ways, but they're stuck in that they can't do the kinds of things that some of these actors are doing, right? They can't make themselves indispensable to the international community because they're not really in control of their own territory. They've tried. They've appealed to the international community saying we can help defeat, we can suppress Hamas, we can defeat Al Qaeda if it ever shows up in our territories. But the reality is that's what Israel is doing, and so they can't serve the international community in the same way that the eastern tribes could when they were fighting in Benghazi against the Islamic State, or the way that the South Yemeni groups are fought against the Houthis, or against ISIS. Whether these are important goals or not is a different issue. But this is how these separatist movements are weighed on the international scales, and the Palestinians haven't been as successful in that respect. If there were some kind of dramatic change in realignment in Israeli politics, or potentially an uprising in Ramallah against the Palestinian Authority, that might change. But I think that's a couple of counterfactual steps down the road.
Go ahead, sir.
Great work, but I was in these rooms a little over 10 years ago, where we, over the course of about 2 years, wore out the furniture trying to establish the lessons learned from the breakup of Yugoslavia. Is there, from what you know of those days, any correlation between what we ended up with in, particularly obviously with Kosovo and Serbia, but in general, Are there any lessons learned there from that exercise that will help us understand the Arab problem?
I think one of the lessons learned is that the process of breaking down of this process of state breakdown is always going to be messy. Right? There is no immaculate partitions. There are a lot of people, going back to Sykes-Picot, who have imagined that you could somehow draw the line in exactly the right way so that everyone shows up on the right side of each line. Whether you do that by taking a poll or having a referendum or plebiscite, however you do it, there's no clean ways to do it. The other big conclusion, I think, or lesson from the Yugoslav case is that there are bigger winners and bigger losers. Slovenia came out of the Yugoslav secession pretty well. Kosovo and Bosnia less well. Croatia kind of in the middle. Serbia is complicated, but we can sort of, there are winners and losers in that transition. And I think I think that we shouldn't just think of it as the loss of, or that the breakdown of the state can only generate anarchy. It can only bad things happen when states break down. I think that the Yugoslav case shows up that the distribution of good and bad is uneven, and some people reap rewards and other people suffer consequences. And a lot of the process of negotiating or managing that breakdown is allocating those consequences. But keeping states together does not seem necessary. It seems to me to be a kind of an overrated prospect. And this is, I don't know about Yugoslavia as well, but when we look at the states of the Arab world, I think, what good have these states done? How much good have they done? How much benefit has there been for their own population or for the world in general? In 2009, the Arab Human Development Report, the sort of subgroup of the UN Development Agency, had this really searing analysis of Arab statehood and said, these states, they're supposed to be protecting their population, they're supposed to be fostering development, and they've failed. They haven't done the things that they were chartered to do, the things that they put in their own constitutions and that the UN gave them sovereignty, granted them sovereignty in order to facilitate. So if you concede, and this was in 2009, so if you concede that these states haven't been working so well, I think that we can I think that the loss of the states or the bringing them to rearranging them may not be as dangerous or as negative as we imagine them to be, because we have to think about the opportunity costs.
Rena?
Hi, Rena.
Hi. Thank you very much. When you talk about the separatist movements, you are in fact, I think, conflating very different types of movements. I'm very puzzled about you putting ISIS as a separatist movement, because it's far from separatist. It's an, if I can call it that way, it's more of an empire building movement. It's not trying to it never tried to secede. That was not the idea. It was to create a much larger entity, going back historically to the idea of the caliphate and so on. And that map that you showed us of all the different provinces that they envisage, it's very interesting in that sense, because it was really a state building movement. It was a horrible concept of the state, but was a state-building movement. I think among the movements that you mentioned, there are not many, it seems to me, that there are truly secessionist movements. The Kurds in Iraq are secessionists. They lost at that battle, and I think right now they're rather crestfallen, and I think from everything I hear, that idea has been put aside for the time being. I don't think the Kurds in Syria are secessionist, because what they are seeking, it's not so much an independent Rojava or or an autonomous Rojava. They want a different concept of the Syrian state. So that I don't know at this point how common the truly secessionist movements are. The Biafra movement in Nigeria a long time ago, the Eritrean movements, and so on. So, could you talk more about these different kind of demands that these states,
that
these groups have?
there's two points there. The first is that some of these groups walk to the edge of seeking independence, but then say, we don't really want independence. We just want autonomy, which is the kind of the Rojava case. And just to a certain extent, the Cyrenaica movement, they build themselves as federalists. They call themselves a federalist movement. I think, though, that when you're willing to take up arms and set up your own governance and ignore the things that come out of the central government, whether you call yourself a federalist agency, federalist movement, or a secessionist movement is irrelevant, because you've broken the state, right? You've denied the monopoly over the use of force, and not just denied it theoretically, but denied it in practice. So the Syrian state that the PYD claims it's loyal to, it's a Syrian state that doesn't exist, and it's not the Syrian state that Assad rules. It's a kind of such a hypothetical thing that they're separatists, right? They may be not secessionists, but they're separating themselves from the state. But that's a kind of a definitional point. ISIS, you're right. ISIS is very strange and very different from these guys. Let's see if this thing is still working. So one of in chapter 6, I think, the second to last chapter of the book, I deal with ISIS, and I argue that ISIS, even though it talked a talk about break all the borders, about expanding territory indefinitely, about ruling from Morocco to Khorasan and all of these things, that in a lot of ways its practice was very similar. The things that it was doing on the ground was very similar to all the other separatist movements. And when we look at where ISIS ended up and where the territory that they declared as being inside ISIS and the territory versus outside ISIS, and they were clear, they had excise duties, so they had a notion that there was a boundary to where they controlled. If you left ISIS territory, you paid an excise tax. That the territory that ISIS ruled was this Jazeera Caliphate, right, was what I call it. ISIS was a movement of the tribes that existed, that the Sunni Arab tribes that dominated the areas between Baghdad to Mosul to Raqqa, all the way towards Aleppo, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which kind of ancient geographers called the Jazeera. And when we look at the territory that ISIS actually ruled, from its capital in Raqqa all the way to Mosul, right, they're pretty much in control of that exact territory. When we look at the evolution of ISIS from starting from Al-Qaeda in Iraq into its pre-ISIS forms into ISIS and then became ISIS, there was always this tension between whether they were a Sunni movement in Iraq or whether they were an Iraqi movement for Sunnis. And they have these weird debates about their own name. I forgot, Fil Iraq or Bil Iraq. They have these discussions about what preposition they should be using. Should it be an idafa and all that? And one of the things that shows up, though, is that the ISIS leadership, they don't really care about Libya, right? ISIS, there are movements in Libya that try and attach themselves to ISIS, but ISIS's own leadership, sitting in Raqqa, their primary concern is reasserting tribal control over the Iraqi-Syria frontier, rebuilding this thing that they had imagined had existed before the arrival of Sykes and Picot. And the possibility of Jazeera's independence is that's the kind of like the last historical appendix. When Faisal writes his letter to the Allies at Versailles, making the case for Arab statehood, he specifically says we should have an Arab state for the Hejaz, we should have an Arab state for Syria, which is civilized, and then we should have a separate Arab state for the semi-civilized areas of Iraq and the Jazeera. He separated the idea that the Jazeera could be a separate kind of mini kingdom, like a kind of like Hungary within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It should be a separate little kingdom within this big Arab enterprise. One of the things I talk about in the book is how Jazeera, how the tribal movements that became ISIS reinvigorated this idea of Jazeera as a place, and you see it in their nom de guerre, their names. They choose names that all refer back to the Jazeera. Some of them actually call themselves Jazairi. They want to make their Jazeera-ness known because they don't want to be part of Iraq and they don't want to be part of Syria anymore. Those political experiments have failed, and now is our chance to make that correction. So I think ISIS fits the separatist mold the least. It's the hardest to fit. I think also that one of the reasons why ISIS is the only separatist movement that isn't still drawing breath is that they were the ones that didn't fit the mold. They were the ones that didn't follow the international community's dictates. They were the ones that had the most expansive push. They were the ones that didn't respect international boundaries. And they were the ones that suffered the most consequences for their defiance of the international community. Every other separatist movement only wanted to change one border. We'll respect the other borders, but we want to change this one little thing we want to move. We want to move this line just a little bit, and the rest, everyone else can be fine. ISIS wanted to break them all, and they suffered the consequences of that defiance of the international community from every direction.
You talk about the international community. You talk about the international community. Could you deal with some of the established countries that don't have much of a tolerance for separatism? Russia being the primary example. It's notoriously put down various separatist movements. China, which has been more quiet on the issue, also doesn't have much of a tolerance. Less important countries like Spain is battling the Catalonians. So do their views play any important role in the international community dealing positively or negatively with these separatist movements?
I think that these countries have been cynical. It might be ungenerous, but practical might be a better way to describe it when it comes to these separatist movements. And if I go back to Osama Bouera, he makes it pretty clear that the Russians were backing the separatist movement in eastern Libya. And we have lots of data on that. So the Russians don't like separatist movements that happen to them. I don't think they mind it happening to other countries as much. They probably oppose the Kurds in Syria, but I think that they were pretty comfortable. They've historically been unopposed to the southern movement in Yemen, right? That's the old PDR. These are old PDRY guys. Those are people. Some of those. The older ones have Russian. They trained in Russia. Some of them. So I don't think that they're consistent in that respect. Whether if it ever came down to a vote at the UN, whether Russia would accept a vote the way that it's rejected the Kosovo vote, I don't know. But I think that they're much more practical when it comes to dealing with these on a case-by-case basis. We could also flip that equation over, though. The only country during the Kurdish referendum, there were dozens of emails and demarches coming from every country in the world saying, "Don't do this. This is a big mistake. We respect Iraq's territorial integrity. We don't make this mistake. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it." And after the referendum, the U.S. and other countries said this referendum has no constitutional validity, and we're going to proceed as if it didn't happen. The only country that I know of that sent a letter of congratulations was the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. They sent a telegram a demarche to Erbil saying, "Congratulations, you pulled it off. Well done. Keep it up." Barzani in particular, but all the separatist movements, they talk about Scotland and Catalonia, right? This is in 2016, 2017. They talk about Scotland and Catalonia all the time. These were examples that they thought put them on the right footing. I think they didn't realize how strong the backlash would be, right? With historical hindsight, we know that those were probably not the best examples to be following. But at the time, that seemed to be on the right side of history. So we have inconsistency from the international community about how to engage separatists. And we have separatists who, probably for their own reasons, look at the international community and only see green lights. They only see encouragement. And it led to probably overplaying their hands, and certainly in the Kurdish case, but in other cases as well, it led them to probably overplay some of their advantages.
Any other questions? No? I just have a final comment. I mean, clearly the Arabs have to rethink the Arab state and how it's functioned, and they have to rethink federalism. And the only example of any kind of federalism I can think of in the Arab world is, of course, the UAE. United Arab Emirates was composed of 7 emirates. I don't know whether something, I mean, what are your final thoughts on rethinking and reforming the Arab state?
Yeah, federalism has a pretty negative connotation in Arabic. Hardly anyone uses the word federalism without some kind of warning, without attaching some kind of warning, which is funny because not funny, but it's ironic because there is the UAE example. There is Iraq has a federalist system that it's certainly not perfect, but it's probably better than some of the other historical periods in Iraq's. Kurdish-Arab relations under federalism are better than they were in the previous era. And there have been historically discussions about federalism in Libya. Federalism might actually become, Libya has been talking about federalism now since the uprising, and it could make a show. Syria, probably not, but hard to say. I think that the key question regarding federalism is not the idea, the sort of the abstract idea of it, but the actual implementation. The UAE example is an example of previously independent entities that agreed to merge. And I've forgotten the details about the UAE, but wasn't Oman supposed to be part of it, and then they backed out at the last minute? Yeah. The idea that you could back out of federalism is kind of a scary proposition. In other countries, though, there's a grave reluctance to allow these previous entities to continue to exist because that would just sow the seeds for the next stage of conflict. So finding some kind of federal system that has cross-cutting, that creates cross-cutting borders instead of just reinforcing pre-existing political cleavages is tricky. And we see it, for instance, in the disputed territories in Iraq. So I think that there's probably a little bit more willingness to entertain the idea, but implementation-wise, I don't think there's been a lot of progress.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ariel, and thank you, David. Thank you all for coming. Please make sure to pick up the flyers. I think it gives you a
good discount.
A good discount for the book. And hopefully we'll see you in the fall for more upcoming events and book launches. Thank you very much.